Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we head to the desert to consider the could-we's and should-we's of airstrikes.
Everybody that uses force is responsible for that.
They're making decisions on things that are a really big deal and have real life consequences.
War is not black and white, it is messy. And it changes and people have to react accordingly.
Also, in this episode, we'll reheat a few stories just in case you missed them, and we'll be finding out who is under the hat this week.
Best location you've served?
It's got to be Afghanistan in Op Herrick during 2013. It was in support of the Chinook fleet, keeping the Merc camp serviceable. I really felt that was making a difference, and I could see that when the casualty was exfilled safely because of our engineering efforts out there.
Now, could we hit it? Should we hit it? Before RAF aircraft can strike a target, these questions must be asked. And it's down to a targeting team's legal advisor and policy advisor to come up with the answers. In a groundbreaking interview for the Royal Air Force, we head to the Middle East to speak with 83 Expeditionary Air Groups, LEGAD and POLAD. Flight Lieutenant Isabel and Tess from the Ministry of Defence, thank you for joining us on Inside Air from a desert airbase somewhere in the Middle East.
It's a pleasure. So I'm just happy that we've managed a connection.
We are subject to technology. Tess from Civil Service, thank you for joining us. And that is very interesting. We'll get to this, why you are out in the Middle East with all the light blue.
Yeah, I'm the only civilian amongst all of these people who like to talk about planes constantly.
So I bet you are very popular when it comes to the quizzes on the base. Would that be true?
You would think, but it turns out that there's very few politics rounds that they like to write. So my subject matter expertise is limited.
You're not so up to date on the soaps out there, I presume.
No, nor the sports. Izzy's got that down, obviously.
But Tess, you're the resident expert on the differences between a C-17 or an A400. At least now you are.
Resident expert might be taking it a little bit far. But I am learning. I have learned a lot of jargon and a lot of acronyms in the last couple of months.
One thing I will say that I'm very jealous of Tess is that she gets to rock up in her own dress or slacks every day. And while my life might be easier in PCS, it's not quite the same as rocking a dress.
Do you know what? We're gonna start with you, Tess. You're in the civil service. Working for the Ministry of Defence, but you've been told to pack your suitcases. You're off to the Middle East for a number of months. What are you doing there with the Royal Air Force?
So I am what is known as a POLAD, which is short for Policy Advisor, which is quite a unique role. There's only a handful across the world deployed at any one time, and we kind of get deployed to support the operational commanders to make decisions informed by government policy and strategic intent back in London and across MOD and the Foreign Office and Number 10, but also to kind of feed back the realities of what's happening on the ground into London. Through a kind of more direct line across kind of policy channels, so that the decisions that are being made are also grounded in a reality of what's happening on the ground. So it's a bit of a kind of curious role, but it's sort of a bit more looking up more strategically than the rest of the people here, who are very rooted in the kind of tactical and what they're doing day to day, as they need to be.
That's interesting, because I worked alongside a POLAD myself many years ago when I was out there myself,
Right.
and I didn't know that he was spying on us and reporting back into Whitehall what we were doing.
Yeah, so you you put it much more indelicately. So I think, like, I mean, you know, it's all above board, and they all know what I'm saying. But I think to be honest, I think the commanders here quite like it, because it means that I can sort of jump, a couple of hoops a bit more directly into London to feedback what's going on, instead of having to go through the military chain of command.
You must have loads of homework to do to keep up to date with everything that's going on in terms of foreign policy.
Yeah, which I actually love. It's amazing that it's a part of my job to read the New York Times every morning and scribble down notes on how things are being perceived, and having chats with my contacts back in London about what's going on, what do ministers think about this, and how quickly is this going to take, and trying to figure out a way to impress that upon people here. So I'm really glad, but yeah, it does mean a lot of reading and a lot of pontificating, I suppose, about what's going to happen next, and which I probably enjoy a bit too much, really.
Let's come across to Isabel. I look at the two of you as the check and balance for operations, particularly targeting. Can you tell us your role as a LEGAD and what makes you different from Tess?
Well, we've got LEGAD, POLAD, and some people like to call us there's a salad as well for trying to get lunch. No, we play off each other a lot. And in a nutshell, I'd almost say that I guess I'm the could we, as in, are there legal permissions? Are we complying with the principles of international humanitarian law, as well as our policy permissions under the rules of engagement? Whereas Tess, I think, is probably the should we. And in many respects, that's a much harder question to ask, because the law is there. We're all schooled in the law. Everybody that comes through who is in the armed forces, will have had that basic training, the principles of LOAC, the laws of armed conflict, and so, but they don't really get the policy schooling as much as what Tess adds. So we're the legal advisor in the room. At any moment that the RAF is going to use force during an armed conflict, you're the legal advisor, ensuring that the UK and its service personnel basically do so legally within the UK's interpretation of international law and criminal domestic law, as well as policy permissions. But there's a lot of overlap, and we're constantly got our heads together trying to work out what's going on, whether it's permissive, and feeding that back into the service personnel whose job it is to prosecute that use of force. And that obviously is quite a serious thing to do. But yeah, we work in conjunction, but Tess definitely has the harder job.
Just so I get this right. So you're saying that you are the could we,
yes,
and Tess is the should we, and the rest of the light blue team, the air component commander at the head of that, is the how do we. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then also they're the ones that will do it as well. So I think we lie outside of that chain. We are the advisors, hence in the name, the legal advisor and the policy advisor. Mm-hmm. Everybody that uses force is responsible for that. So you go back to the Nuremberg trials and the prosecution of individuals, is that it's unlawful to obey an unlawful order. You are responsible for your own actions. So we all feed into it together, but ultimately every service personnel has to take responsibility for that.
Okay. Tess, can you add to that?
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting experience, because it's for the service person or the commander to take the decision that is in their judgment, and our role is to say, we can have really quite strong views about what they can and can't do, but ultimately it's they are empowered to take a decision, and they have a lot of responsibility in taking that decision. So a lot of about what we do is about how we communicate and how we influence influence the decisions they're making, and communicate in a way that makes them listen to us, which is quite interesting. So we definitely do kind of sit, outside of what we provide, a kind of unique vantage point that they wouldn't ordinarily get.
Just to be clear about what we're talking about here, although you haven't said it yet, you're talking about targeting. Perhaps you could tell us about the full spectrum of targeting, where it starts and where it finishes.
Goodness me, how long do you have?
Well, broadly speaking, please.
So I guess it goes down to the permissible use of lethal force. And that means that when we're in armed conflict, it's governed by what's called international humanitarian law. You might hear the term LOAC, the laws of armed conflict, which covers essentially when you're allowed to use lethal force in both offensive operations, but also then self-defense, so defensive operations. And targeting law comes under both. So you can have offensive use of force where you have to comply with those principles. So distinction and necessity, humanity, proportionality, but also the rules of engagement that every country, so the UK has their own set. You have to abide by that when you're using offensive use of force to prosecute targets. So we're talking here about aerial warfare, so aircraft using lethal force. And then the defensive use of force is that self-defense element, which falls under UK domestic law, and when you're allowed to, as long as it's proportionate and necessary, when you can act in self-defense. And that's probably the broadest way of describing what we're doing when we talk about targeting law.
And I think there's also, targeting is a really large umbrella, and it includes, maybe an ideal that, a lot less, but things like, non-kinetic effects. So anything that has an effect, really. So cyber or information operations would also come under this kind of broader, what's known as the targeting cycle.
This sounds like a huge responsibility. I mean, that's an understatement to say it's a huge responsibility. How do you cope with this responsibility that you have personally? That's
a really good question.
What a question.
Snap. I think a lot of it is your training kicks in. We've been. Yeah. It takes years in order to get into position where you're going to be able to be deployed out into an operations center. And one of the things that I found, I don't know whether that reassuring is the word, but quite impressive from a UK perspective, is that in any targeting team, so to speak, the amalgamation of expertise is incredible. Everybody comes from very distinct areas of the Air Force, whether it be the pilots or the INT officers or the targeteers or the liaison officers. Everybody feeding into this, as well as the LEGAD and the POLAD. And we're all working in one big team, but I wouldn't say it's a flat structure. I mean, we're in the military, there's a hierarchy, of course, but we're feeding in with our own that own training, and it kicks in. And you're in the room, you're in the zone, so to speak, and you rely on that. And you also have the confidence that everybody else can do that job, their job, and know that you can do it too. So I think it's just a human reaction. You could just I mean, I imagine it's the same when you ask about sports persons who get into the zone. You're focused, and it's only when you reflect on it you think, goodness, that was quite something.
Tess, just thinking about your circumstances, you haven't come through the military. You haven't had years of IRT, your annual training, where you're looking at weapons and discussing law of armed conflict. How does this sit with you? How are you finding the job?
So I think obviously it was daunting at first, but I think Izzy hits the nail on the head in the sense that you are part of a team, and there's a mutual respect and trust there, and a willingness to listen, and often it doesn't feel as formal as LEGAD's now is time to input, or the POLAD's opportunity to input. We're a lot more discursive, and we, the imperative is that if you have any doubt or any questions, that you voice those, and it's a sort of safe space to do that, because you need to, because if not, then you're going to get something wrong. But I also think, having had a few years experience working at the more strategic level, from a very different perspective in London, I've definitely sort of realised that there is a reason that I'm doing this role, and I have that experience of understanding how decisions are reached, and how the same concerns that ministers have at the strategic level, we also have at the tactical level, and I have that to bring to the table, and I think that's really come out in the last couple of months, is that I do know the answers to the questions that are being asked of me, which is reassuring. But I think, everyone, we rehearse, and we train quite regularly, and that means that you keep it current. You're constantly refreshing your knowledge and your understanding of the various issues, and trying to come at the problems from different angles all the time, and that just enables us to not get complacent, and to make sure that we're ready, because when these situations arise, they're often at very short notice and very urgent, so you have to be ready to go all the time, basically 24/7, especially for the targeting team.
What Tess says there, so about the relevance, is such an important thing as well, because it was only in the first Gulf War that LEGAD started deploying with armed forces, and Tess, I don't know how recently POLADs have started deploying, but that relevance in knowing that use of force is such it is that last resort. Under the UN Charter, states aren't supposed to, in essence, of the direst of circumstances, namely self-defense, resort to the use of force. So when it does happen, you want to make sure that it's done properly and ethically in line with both law and policy. So knowing that you play that role, I think that almost it drives you, it motivates you to want to be in that room and want to be doing the job to the best of your ability. I find it incredibly fulfilling in that respect, and that if we're going to be in this situation, let's make sure it's done correctly.
And I think because we're also deployed, in a lot of ways, what to me were a bit more intangible ideas back in London, they feel a lot more real. You're a lot closer to them when you're deployed. So it's almost sometimes easier to think through the kind of political, reputational, should we issues that I have to think about, because I'm closer to them, which is an important part of the reason why you have a POLAD deployed and you have a LEGAD deployed, and not just on the other end of a phone back in London, which would otherwise be what would happen.
But you can feel the tempo in the room.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're just closer to it, and you're immersed in it all the time. You know these people, you know the ins and outs of, you're following the operations every day, and by being more immersed in it, you can relate to it more, and you can you recognise the issues as they come.
Now, working so closely with the targeting team and being part of that team, how do you avoid groupthink?
Well, first of all, it's like having that civilian in the room in Tess. If Tess can pipe up, then that means I can too, right? No, I think really it's the training, and we're encouraged to interject not only in your specific area, but we're a team. So if there is something that you're uncomfortable with, or you don't think that you've gone through that process correctly, then everybody, whether you're a wing commander, a group captain, a civilian, or a flight lieutenant like I am, you're there to play a role, and you're empowered to do that. Now, I'm not saying that that's unusual in the military, but certainly that flak structure and that sort of that active encouragement is, and I think it works incredibly well. But certainly it's quite fun with if Tess can get away with something, and I'm not talking about in the context of targeting, then it means I probably can too as well.
Yeah, I think it's probably slightly easier for me as a civilian to provide that challenge. But I think it's also, as we're saying, it's a very discursed environment, but we also do have set roles, and those roles are enshrined in targeting policy. You have to have a LEGAD there, you have to have a POLAD there, and therefore that creates the structure in which the commanders naturally calls on you, because they know that that's part of the process they need to follow. And I think also they recognise that they hold a lot of responsibility, and ultimately, as we were saying before, we give advice. We don't make the decision, they make the decision. So if they make, they're making decisions on things that are a really big deal and have real life consequences, and they want to be able to feel like they didn't leave any stone unturned, they didn't miss anything, and they consulted all the right people. Because if they didn't, then that's going to be really difficult for them.
How easy is it to raise your voice and say, "Hang on a minute, I don't think this is right"?
Incredibly easy, and I'm genuinely not just saying that, but I think it goes back to what Tess is saying, is that that responsibility to use that force, it lies on that individual. So they want you to interject, they want to empower you, and one thing I'd add to that is that while under the Geneva Conventions, commanders have to have access to legal advice when they're conducting operations. Having a LEGAD and a POLAD in the actual room is something that is not saying it's unusual, but not every nation does that. I mean, this is a UK requirement, not an international law requirement, and I think that's an incredibly encouraging thing. They're saying we need you, and that I think is the most that makes it easy for me to interject, so to speak.
So when I watch the news at 10 tonight, and if there's been an airstrike somewhere, I can feel confident that this has been thoroughly looked at before it happened. Is that how I should feel?
I think, and Tess, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that most people, if they saw the scrutiny and the policy and the constraints that the UK has in place before any use of force, I think it's a quite impressive thing.
I think it's definitely more than a lot of people would expect. I think that the UK is doing as much as it possibly can to manage what is often a dynamic and unpredictable environment, and that is that there's only so much that you can do on operations, because things can happen very quickly. But I think the level of thought and consideration that goes into ensuring there are as many checks and balances as possible, notwithstanding the dynamism, is definitely a lot more than I think the average person would expect when they watch the news.
You've already mentioned that sometimes you don't have much time to go through this process, but I'm sure you do it right every time. What happens when you've got aircrew that identify a situation that could warrant a response, a kinetic response? Well, how much autonomy do we give to our aircrew for them to make decisions?
So we're in constant communication. Especially, so in any operation will be in constant communication. That's what our role is, I guess, so we work in the Combined Air Operations Centre, which is the CAOC, and there'll be this constant the comms between the pilots in the cockpit, the command center where we are, and then you've also got the permanent joint headquarters, 11 group as well from the RAF, all feeding in. And it depends, really. It depends on the situation. It depends on the permissions under UK policy, who has authority under certain circumstances. And I think the only thing really to say from a sort of more broad perspective is self-defense is always, nothing can fetter that inherent right of self-defense of yourself or UK personnel, and depending on policy agreements, allies as well. So I think that's probably as much as we can go there, Tess.
Yeah, agreed.
I think the reassuring thing that I find here is that the decisions aren't made before the aircrew walk to the aircraft to take off. That process is continual, even when the aircraft is in the air and over the target.
Oh, absolutely. And that's also one of the, the principles of the law of armed conflict, is that the moment that something is no longer humane or necessary, or you can distinguish a military objective, you, by law, have to stop using that use of force. And I think, again, another really reassuring thing from a LEGAD perspective is that our aircrew and everybody that I've worked with are incredibly read up on this. They know exactly what they're doing when they can and when they can't use that force. So yeah, it's, hence the term, I guess, dynamic targeting. It is a dynamic situation. War is not black and white. It is messy, and it changes, and people have to react accordingly.
Isabel, what do you find most challenging about your job?
Sleep.
Oh, right.
It's we're on 24-hour call the whole time. So I think and the nature of these things, that quite often you are kind of sort of hauled out of bed in order to advise on certain things. And I'm quite grumpy, but don't tell anybody. Otherwise, I think it's that responsibility we mentioned earlier. You are the LEGAD in the room. There's nobody else there giving that legal advice, and you're the person that people turn to, rely on. And I guess that pressure. I think communication is probably also sometimes not so much a challenge, but the importance of it can be underestimated. That I think that's, if we look back at scenarios in the past on the use of nuclear weapons, etc., you hear some of the tales of the closest that we've come have been down to miscommunication. So I think that's always making sure that what can be sometimes quite complex areas of law or policy are communicated to the people on the ground. And then I'd say the final thing here is probably the fact that almost everything that we do now is done in close conjunction with international allies. So the nature of modern operations is that the UK is rarely operating alone. And while this is a challenge, because we all have our own interpretations of the laws of armed conflict and our own policies to apply as well, it's also one of the most rewarding parts of the job, and interesting as well, to sort of try to work out how these different nations do interpret things. And it means you can have a really quite a diverse working environment, but which is rewarding because you're working towards a common aim that you believe in. So yeah, it's a varied but incredibly interesting role.
Okay. Tess, what's the hardest thing for you in the job?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. I think trusting your instincts and feeling confident that I know what I'm talking about. And I think because, Izzy and I, we're one person deep. So, I am the POLAD deployed here, and Izzy is the LEGAD. So you obviously, I have my chain of command back in London that I can call, but they're only in, they're in work. UK working hours, and a lot of the time these things happen quite quickly. So it can feel like a lot of responsibility. But I think ultimately, I think we train so frequently and we run through these things so frequently that you kind of build that confidence quite quickly. And we have an environment in which you can just pipe up and say, I'm not sure about this, and everyone there is receptive to hearing what you have to say, which is really important. But I think managing that, because for me, and I think for Izzy as well, the targeting team is just one part of what I do here, and actually often a quite small part, because there's so much going on, especially at the moment around the region, to kind of keep track of. So you can kind of just have to, and then suddenly, you have a targeting situation that you need to be part of, and you're sort of re-gearing your brain to make sure that you're in the zone, which can be tricky.
And in between that, you're swatting up on policy.
Yes, yeah, trying to find out what's going on, and constantly trying to find out what's going on and how it might be relevant to what we're doing here.
Tess is also having to field numerous questions from just about everybody that wants to know what's happening in the real world as well. So I'll apologise here, Tess, but she is often answering questions from inquisitive persons on the KOC floor.
So what do you both love most about the work that you do, or what do you find most rewarding?
I mean, it's so interesting, and it's so unique, and especially for me, I'm not a military person, and I've had a fascinating career so far, but it's all in London. It's all you're so far removed from what's going on, and these POLAD roles for civilians are those opportunities to be in for what feels to me like in the thick of it. And I learned so much kind of tactical detail and how the military really works than I ever would anywhere else, and they're so unique in that sense. So what in my old job would come into my desk with a sort of con-op on a slide, that's just a piece of paper, whereas I can now understand all of the work that went into that, and the different dynamics, the loads of different functions that create that bit of work. And so that is incredibly rewarding to be a part of that, and to be someone providing a unique function here, and those moments where you feel like you have added value and you've enhanced and enabled. That's really what we've tried to do. I think you're here, and I definitely heard before I come out a lot of banter about POLADs and LEGADs. I think especially POLADs, that you might disagree, about us being the ones to pull the handbrake when someone's got a good idea. But I think really what we're really trying to do is enable activity to happen in the right way. And when you're able to do that and you play a part in that, it's incredibly rewarding and really unique. You're not going to get that in many other jobs.
That's definitely something I'll latch onto there that Tess alluded to, the learning about the different areas and different expertises within the Air Force. I can tell you, sir, that my acronym list now has expanded about tenfold. It's the brevity terms, the NATO brevity terms that I really like. Things like what it means to when you've got feet wet or feet dry. So these are aircraft over land or water, or the other one I've seen is they're holding hands, which apparently means they're all in formation. So these are all wonderful things that I wouldn't get exposed to otherwise as a lawyer. And I think similarly with Tess, while obviously being a commissioned officer in the Air Force means that you outside of operations, it's a bit you are in the military, and so even if you're advising on discipline or criminal law or other aspects, it's not quite as far removed being in an operations centre. But it's still as a lawyer, it's incredibly different to what you imagined at the start of one's career. That seeing that tangible, immediate relevance that you have to combat operations that really distinguishes us from a civilian lawyer. I think of, I could be sitting in a London office with a latte in my hand, reading a bunch of documents, and yet you're here being very relevant to decisions that you can't possibly compare to looking at, some contract to make somebody richer, frankly. So it's that tangible, the relevance, and the team. I find it absolutely fascinating. The combining of so many different elements together, and I came into the Air Force. I wanted to be a lawyer and be a LEGAD. I wasn't aiming to be a pilot or anything, but goodness, it's interesting. And I'm not just saying that.
Yeah. You're not involved in recruiting by any chance, are you? It's a fair question, actually, because a couple of years ago we had a chat. Episode 11, we did the Law of Armed Conflict in Space and Cyber with Stu and Kieran. And I know that subsequent to that, some lawyers listened to that and then joined the Royal Air Force. Why would someone want to become a LEGAD when they would probably have to take a pay cut?
I tell you, sir, that when I remember going into basic training, I must have been in March, and I thought I'd timed it nicely because it was going into the summer. But about week 2, I was standing there in my greens with a helmet on, and it was sleeting sideways. And I did think that just a few weeks ago, I had been in a London office with a latte in my hand, and what on earth had my life decisions led me to this particular point? But then I also kind of realised that I was running around in a field with a rifle and getting sort of, paid as a lawyer. And how often would any lawyer think of doing that? It was actually rather fun because you didn't have to think about anything apart from ironing your clothes vaguely straight, which I still struggle to do, frankly. It's a unique existence. I think that's probably the simplest way of saying it, is that you normally as a lawyer, I guess the more experienced you become, the higher up you go, the more pointed your expertise, the more narrow you become. Whereas you come to the RAF and you're a generalist. You could be out in operations. You could be doing criminal law, working in the Service Prosecution Authority. You could be doing advisory law. You could be giving advice on discipline, on policy. You could be at the permanent joint headquarters, PGHQ. You could be in a NATO post. You might be in defence engagement as well, and it could change in the flick of a couple of fingers. And I think that's what attracted me, certainly, is that, first of all, being the lawyer in the room on operations, that's an experience that you just can't have as a civilian lawyer, being a commissioned officer. But then that variety and that kind of unknown. And I think that if you ask other LEGADs in the profession, there's about 45 of us. I think that's a similar. The common theme is that uniqueness, so to speak, of being here. And the law it's developing, especially in the RAF and the stuff that we get involved in. So I think that last podcast episode with the LEGAD Squadron Leader Stu and Wing Commander Kieran discussed things like cyber domain and the space domain and all these rapidly developing areas of law that they're constantly changing, and that makes the job and the prospects rather fun.
Now, I think most people listening, or many people listening, would know how to join the Royal Air Force and maybe just click on the page that says legal services. But Tess, how do you become a POLAD?
Yeah, interesting question. I don't know. I got really lucky, I think. I fell into it. I did an international relations degree. I've always been interested in it. So I've always been a bit of a nerd, and I probably followed a bit more of the traditional path. Went to uni, studied it, applied for a job, got the job, and then moved around a bit within it. But I think there's actually lots of different ways of getting into the civil service that I definitely didn't know about, and that just takes a bit of googling. And I think there's loads of variety in the civil service. There's lots of different things to do, and once you're in it, it's really flexible and really easy to move around. So you might be refreshing the page every day looking for a POLAD role and not finding any, and then therefore not applying for anything. But there's lots of other interesting jobs to do, and once you're in, I started in a very different role. I was writing correspondence and replying to letters from the public, which has nothing to do with policy at all. And that's how I started. And I did that for a year, and it was actually a great job. And then I kind of moved directly from that into a policy job. So I would sort of, if you're interested in it, get in, do something, and then it's a unique professional environment, in that it's easier than many places to move around and try something you find a bit more interesting.
So it's been really good to talk to you both about both the law of armed conflict and the role of the LEGAD and the role of the policy advisor on operations. For each of you, what are going to be your biggest takeaways when you go back home? How have these roles influenced you as people?
I think, I guess, not to repeat myself, but it's a really unique vantage point you get here, and I will understand the plight of the tactical level if and when I am back at the strategic level much better. And I think it will just enhance my decision making and my policy making so much better, being able to understand how things are put together and how it plays out forward. I also think being that one person deep is a really unique thing that everyone, there's lots of people doing policy, and policy is driving things at the strategic level, whereas here it's like a kind of enhanced to what is ultimately a kind of military planning process. So being that kind of one voice is not something that I would normally have. So that will be an incredible takeaway to take back with me. But just being able to really visualize and picture military operations as they are happening is such a unique kind of personal experience for me. So that will just enhance whatever job I do next.
Thank you. Isabel.
So for me, I think the world is an insane place, and I think I knew that before I came out. Humans are fallible, irrational, etc., always have been, probably always will be. I think it's that comfort in knowing that those protocols, those procedures, that adherence to the laws and the policy, that they're in place, they're there. And I think that, and seeing that in action and being part of that has been just incredibly reassuring, because I don't think the world is going to get any less mad. There's arguments to say that it's becoming more so. But I think that there is that reassurance there in the role that the UK plays and how it goes about it, which is something to be incredibly proud of. And then I think the second thing is just, we all have our defined roles in the Air Force, and we probably all think that we're the most important people in the room. But it's an appreciation, I think, for the contributors to that decision making and that team. It's been a fascinating ride. Although the one thing that I will definitely take away and never quite get my head around is the capacity for pilots to be able to watch a screen with their aircraft of choice doing not that much for hours on end. And there is a specific wing commander who will remain nameless, and I've never seen such excitement on a person's face, just sitting there watching. And it's interesting. They're nice looking aircraft, and there's some aesthetically pleasing sort of features to them, but to me that kind of novelty wears away after a couple of minutes. Not to most pilots, and perhaps that's why I do my role and they do theirs.
Brilliant. I hope he listens to this, and he will be nodding his head. Well, look, Flight Lieutenant Isabel, Tess, thank you both for what you're doing currently, and it's reassuring to hear what we've heard about the checks and balances that are in place. And thank you both for being on Inside Air.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
I'm AS1 Victoria Andrews, and this is Reheat for Inside Air. The RAF has signed a formal agreement with the Italian Air Force, which paves the way for the servicing and maintenance of each other's Typhoon and F-35B Lightning aircraft. Once established, RAF engineers will be able to service and undertake some cross-maintenance activities on Italian Air Force aircraft and vice versa. The new practice will take place during exercises and air policing operations. The move is part of wider NATO Agile Combat Employment initiatives to improve nations' mutual operational advantage by operating better together. The 100% sustainable aviation fuel Voyager team has been awarded the Royal Aeronautical Society Silver Medal for the first flight of a large military aircraft that didn't use fossil fuels. It was the first UK flight powered by 100% sustainable aviation fuel, which is made from waste substances like cooking oil. The awards recognise individuals and teams who've made an exceptional contribution in the aerospace, aviation or space industries. Whether an outstanding achievement, a major technical innovation, exceptional leadership, or for work that will advance the industry. The RAF Benson Women's Network has run a successful event to introduce women to weight training, increasing confidence levels in the gym and encouraging healthy bodies and minds. The network aims to promote increased confidence and career advancement and is encouraging of diverse perspectives, promotion of gender equality, and improving the working environment at the station. And the first RAF versus Army darts match has taken place between RAF Bryce Norton and Tidworth Garrison. The Bryce darts community looks to build relationships with armed forces teams across the country, while developing an inclusive league for players to take part in. On this occasion, it was the RAF team who clinched the win with a scoreline of 14-7 in favour of the men and women in light blue. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
I'm AS1 Ben Russell, and this is Under the Hat, where we get to know an aviator in less than a minute. Name you're known by.
I'm Corporal John Stanbridge, also known as Stanners.
What's your profession?
I'm an aircraft avionics instructor based at RAF Cosford within the number 1 school of technical training.
What's the best thing about your job?
Got to be the students that I get to work with. I enjoy being able to share my knowledge, the experiences, and hopefully I can inspire some passion towards engineering when I'm teaching. The flexibility that I've got in the workplace to facilitate learning in my own ways is key as well. I really enjoy that.
Hardest part of your job?
The worst thing is sometimes it can get a bit repetitive teaching the same phase every few weeks, but I do have the bonus that the students do change, which seems to keep me on my toes.
Best location you've served?
It's got to be Afghanistan in Op Herrick during 2013. It was in support of the Chinook fleet, keeping the Merc camp serviceable. I really felt that was making a difference, and I could see that when the casualty was exfilled safely because of our engineering efforts out there.
What bit of luxury kit do you never deploy without?
I'll probably never go without my gym kit. It's not quite luxury, but I find it really helps me to unwind and keep in shape, especially for the trainers I do as a GB bobsleigh athlete.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
It has to be representing the RAF and my country internationally as a GB bobsleigh athlete on the World Cup and at inter-service level. It's took me nearly 10 years of physical training to make it, and I wouldn't be here without the RAF support.
Thank you, Corporal Stanbridge. Your bobsleighing prowess has stopped us going downhill fast on another instalment of Under the Hat.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.